sushi platter did not actually come from a biological grandchild, but from, and it wasn't me unfortunately, but from one of those many who saw Mrs. Goldman as Bobbe Esther, even though we were privileged to have her genes. On the one hand, there's no question that Bobbe Esther would not want this to be in any way a somber event. On the other hand, of Ad Chosid Min Haaretz, we've lost truly a giant of a woman. I'll try to interweave some fond memories together with perhaps some messages that we can take. As Mendel pointed out, I did have the privilege of spending 6 months in her home. One of the most magnificent things about Bobbe Esther was her brutal honesty. You know, if you look at those of you who have these on your seats, you look at the Matzevi, the tombstone, is probably the best description of Bobbe Esther. And perhaps what I'll do is I'll look at a couple of the wording that exists here and elaborate upon it. It says, Atzasa emuna midasa emes. Her counsel was sage and was integral, and her attribute was truth. Truth and honesty. She told it the way that it was. And when she told it the way that it was, no matter how brutal it was, you said thank you, and you appreciated it, and it was the most wonderful thing that you'd ever heard. I'll never forget that the first place I took my then-to-be wife, whom we just got engaged to see, was Bobbe Esther. Because one thing I knew for sure, that if Bobbe Esther didn't like her, there would be no ambiguity about it, and I would exactly know that we got to start the whole process afresh. Well, thank God she didn't throw that curveball. Remember that in those days, it was still possible to get a kapota made by the tailor who made the kapotas for the Rebbe. And as a young bochen, having had the opportunity to spend time with the Rebbe, so it was certainly part of that connection that we sometimes wanted to have. As my late father would say, well, thank God I had a wealthy father, which wasn't necessarily true, but at least he made an effort. And I would spend hours traveling to Mr. Hahn's to have the silk kapota, the exact same silk that the Rebbe had, and have the Rebbe's tailor make the kapota that would fit exactly. I mean, who gets a kapota made to order? But I went, and it was a travel, and it was schlep each time, and then you had the first fitting, and the second fitting, and the third fitting. Anyhow, finally we've got the kapota made. This is the kapota. It's made by the Rebbe's own tailor, and I bring it, and I needed also another one just in case you didn't want to use this one up. So I went to another one where you bought it off the rack, and I came, and I need to find out what it looks like. So I asked Bobbe Esther, I asked Mrs. Goldman, I put on this handcrafted, beautiful kapota, light silk, and she looks at it, okay, and let me see the other one. And I put on this cheap, off-the-rack kapota. She looks at it, she says, I prefer the second one. The first one's no good. My whole world came crumbling down, but there was an honesty and integrity. So midasa emes. If there was one thing that characterized Bobbe Esther was that there was an honesty, there was an integrity to everything that she did. Never forget, she recounted a story. In the early years when the Rebbe took over from his father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe.
Small cheese.
So Mrs. Goldman apparently knew a lady who never had a child with severe problems. And, you know, it used to go through good times and more difficult times. And whenever it was a more difficult time, she obviously would go to the Rebbe. And now there was call it a change of guard, if you will. The Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, had passed away. The Rebbe, his son-in-law, had taken over, and she had that stage where she needed to go to the Rebbe to ask for advice, to ask for bracha. And she presents her woes to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe asks her, tell me, do you light Shabbos candles? So she says no. So the Rebbe said to her, start lighting Shabbos candles and you'll have a bracha. She came out, she went to Mrs. Goldman, she was furious. I don't like this new Rebbe. Why? What's wrong? The previous one, if I went in and I needed a bracha and I needed help, I went in, he gave me a blessing, there was no fee. This new Rebbe, I went in and already he's making demands on me. I don't like this new Rebbe. But in a sense, that characteristic really to me defines in many ways Bobbe Esther. There's a Gemara which tells us a story. I love the story being in the rabbinate. And you'll understand in a moment why. I'm sure Rabbi Goldman doesn't have this problem, but I sometimes do, probably more often than not. Rabbi Akiva was standing in front of his students. We all know he had 24,000 students, didn't have a microphone like this, and he's giving a shiur. And some of the children fell asleep. Some of the students fell asleep whilst Rabbi Akiva was giving a shiur. That's why I can relate. And in order to wake them up, what does he do? So today, probably you take the mic and put it next to the speaker and get a little bit of a screech like we heard before. That should get them up. What does Rabbi Akiva do? He says, I'd like to tell you as follows. The Pasuk says in the Torah, this week's Parsha, Vayiyu chayei Sora mea shana v'esim shana v'sheva shanim, that the longevity of the life of Sarah Imenu, of the matriarch Sarah, was 100 years and 20 years and 70 years. And Esther, Queen Esther, ruled over 127 countries. And with that, everybody woke up, sat at attention, and listened to the rest of the shiur which took a few hours. Not dissimilar to what I'm going to do now. So the question is, how on earth did that inspire the students to wake up? And the answer is that in those few words, what they were saying, what Rabbi Akiva was saying is as follows. That Sarah Imenu lived for 127 years. Each one of those 127 years was a day that was totally filled to the brim, like her husband. When it says, V'Avraham Zokin Baba Yomim, that every single day of Avraham Avinu's life was imbued with meaning, with purpose, with activity, and with success. And the same thing was true with Sarah Imenu. She lived for 127 years, and there was no downtime. There was never a sense that she could sit back and relax. And the consequence of that was that in future generations, Esther HaMalka, Queen Esther, would become the queen to Achashverosh, who ruled over 127 lands. And in each one of those lands, there were districts. In each one of those districts, there were cities. In each one of those cities, there were streets. And the reason why she merited to rule over all of those areas was because of Sarah Imenu's 127 years. Each year was filled with days, each day was filled with hours, each hour was filled with minutes, and each minute was filled with seconds, minutes, hours, days, and years that were totally suffused with meaning and with purpose. And this startled the Bochum, because they realized that not only is time short, but what we do with our lives and the meaning that we imbue into them has a meaning and a purpose not just for now, but for all future generations. When I think of the time, and as